Welcome, everyone, to Ladder Daily Digest. We honor creators, and we have back with us for the 20th time, Cheryl Bruno. Thanks for coming, Cheryl.
Good to be here.
And it's not the 20th time. It's just like the 5th time, maybe, because of Journal of Mormon Polygamy got you on.
I've been here a few times.
That's right. And so we're going to talk about a book that came out last year, and I can show it right now.
There it is.
First, what's the name of it?
Secret Covenants. New issues.
So this is secret, not sacred.
Secret Covenants.
You know, Gene, I think what we ought to do is have a special robe that we give to our guests once they've appeared 5 times.
Right, like on Saturday Night Live.
Saturday Night Live. You know, the 5-time club.
The 5-time club,
so,
yeah.
You know, Cheryl, you're close to getting your robe.
Oh, that would be awesome, Gene.
I'm going to put Randy in charge of what the robe is and how it looks like, and I'll have him design it. So, Cheryl, tell us a little bit about your early life, even though we did it before, and we'll have a reference to that show soon. Tell us.
Okay. I can't remember what I said, so I'll just, go on about myself, and hopefully I'll say something new. But I grew up in Longmeadow, Massachusetts, so on the East Coast, and I was not a member of the church, but I did join the church when I was quite young, and so, well, not quite young, missionary age. And so now that I'm older, I feel like I've been in the church a really long time.
So you were just a civilian. You were just a civilian in high school.
I was a civilian, yes. I didn't go through like young women's, but then I had many, many children. And so I feel like I've gone through young women's and scouts and everything else because I did that kind of through my children. Right. And so you can't really call me a convert. I'm just not a convert, but I am. My father was a Protestant minister. So I do have, a little bit of that background, but I really feel so immersed in Mormonism. I feel like I have pioneer ancestors. I cry on Pioneer Day, and, so I just really feel that I am culturally a Mormon as well as physically a Mormon. And I loved my experiences in the church. I went on a mission to Montreal, Canada. And that was like a year after I had joined the church. And so that just got me right in, and then went to BYU for a couple of years after my mission.
Now, was that an English-speaking mission?
It was French-speaking.
It was
Montreal, Montreal, Canada. So French.
That's what I was wondering, if maybe it was French.
Yes. So I learned a little bit of French, and for a few years I could speak it, but it's gone out the window by now. Just every once in a while I'll get a few words that come into my brain. But the missionary,
like fiance and buffet and
right.
Yeah.
Kind of like that, yeah.
Coup d'etat.
Ménage à trois. All kinds of things pop in. But yes, so I loved my mission. It was wonderful. And we have a little Facebook group of all of our missionaries, and it's so much fun. Every once in a while, somebody will pop up a few pictures from our mission, and we'll look at ourselves at a young age and think those were the glory days. It was fun. And going to BYU was fun. That's where I met my first husband at BYU. He proposed in front of the Provo Temple, the wedding cake temple, and all of those kind of things that everybody does. I did.
You got your MRS degree there.
I did get my MRS degree. So I was doing a graduate degree. I was getting my master's in educational psychology, and I got married and got pregnant right away. So I quit that. And so I do not have my master's degree. I'm sort of all but thesis. But I never regretted that. I had 8 children. 7 of them are girls. And so it was a girl family. It was a really fun girl family. Oh, my children are just delightful. They're wonderful. And I can't say enough good about my children. They never give me any problems. The few problems I had with them were just very benign. And they grew up very Mormon also as well. So we all talk the talk, walk the walk, and everything else. So, but when I went to Vernal, Utah, that was the age of blogging. So I had a blog in Vernal, Utah, and I called myself Bored in Vernal. And my blog was Highing to Kolob. And so when I started that blog, I started getting a little bit more nuanced as a Mormon. So, we talked about all kinds of Mormon issues. And so that's why I think I became a nuanced Mormon at that time. So that's what I consider myself now is, yes, I go to church, I teach Relief Society, I teach Sunday school. All my kids have grown up in the church, but I have that nuance, so you might hear me say things that maybe aren't quite the things that any church-going Mormon would say.
So you did the blog because you had thoughts and you wanted to express them?
Yes, that's a really good
amazing.
It's a good way of putting it. Mm-hmm.
So Cheryl, so I understand you're currently active in the church? Yes.
Okay. I'm active in the Marina Ward here in Monterey, California.
I have to ask, what was your first husband's name?
Frank Bruno.
How did Frank do in a family with 7 girls?
He did terrible. He did not do well. Oh, but poor thing, you have to learn as you go. I mean, he would, when our kids were little, he would say things like, I'm never letting my girls shave their legs until they're 16 years old. And I thought, girls get hairy legs long before 16 years old. That's not going to work. So he had to learn a lot of things.
Well, I have 1 daughter and 3 sons. And let me tell you, I by the time my daughter, and she's wonderful now, but by raising her, it's like, man, I'm glad the other 3 are boys.
Oh, there was so much emotions happening in our home. Yes. The drama, we call it the Bruno drama. And when my girls were teenagers and boys would come to the home and we would laugh and say, if they can get through, the first couple of weeks of Bruno drama, then we'll know if they're really serious or not.
Wonderful.
And so for writing the blog, where did you start to write something that got somebody's attention that you could write or whatever, or from there?
I love doing things that got people's attention. So I did write about polygamy on there. I wrote about, what would happen if your, when your husband calls you up out of the grave. I can't remember. I wrote one blog post that people liked called, I would totally have slept with Joseph Smith. And I really feel like that's true. He would have captured my heart. I just wrote whatever came to my head. And it was quite interesting. My first husband was very much a Boyd K. Packer man. He was very, very conservative Mormon. And we had a blog that went on for a short period of time called He Said, She Said, where we'd come on and we'd give both sides of an issue. I'd give the more nuanced side and he'd give the very conservative side. And that was a really fun thing to do with our disagreements.
Yeah. Love that.
So you guys agreed to disagree.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. That's healthy. And then what was your first project that got into a book or anything like that?
So, yes, the first book I did was called Method Infinite. I worked with 2 Mormon Masons, Freemasons, and we wrote this book about Mormonism and Masonry. It took about 20 years to do. Back then, you couldn't get all your information off the internet. You had to actually go to the archives and do the work, find the newspapers in their dusty state. And so it took a lot of time to do the research for that book. And it was published by Koford, who took a chance on us. And it was a wonderful, I think it's still selling pretty well these days. And I think it's still very, it's very useful. It hasn't kind of gone out. Some of these books you write, and then 5 seconds later they're not relevant anymore. But
And we interviewed you last year about that book, and so we'll include a link to that book. And I remember that they were compiling documents, and they kind of brought you in to help organize, and then you got to actually write a lot with them. And so they said, we're going to have to put you on the cover of the book as an author as well.
Well, yes. Well, that's sort of what happened. They did have me come in to just like organize the files. Joe Swick wanted, Nick Latursky had done a lot of the preliminary research for this book. He'd spent years and years doing this research, and he decided to go in a different direction with his life. And he left Mormonism, and he, for a while, was not interested in it anymore. So he handed over all his materials to Joe Swick. And Joe became my second husband, and after my first husband passed away. And he originally just wanted me to organize his files. And as I started going through, I was like, no, we got to write this up. We got to write this up right away. This is really interesting. And so I started writing, and he began to, after a while, he started having some strokes, and he was unable to do a lot of the writing. And so by this time, I was just kind of pulling things out of his brain and writing them down. And so I ended up being the primary writer of the book. But it owes so much to those two men who both are brilliant and had really brilliant minds, and you'll see all that influence in the book.
Cheryl, I have to ask you, because this subject intrigues me. As a matter of fact, Gene and I just recently did a podcast regarding Masonry, but the book being read, I don't know what the demographics would be for it, but is it a book that would be encouraging for members, or would it put questions in?
So that was one of our goals. We wanted to write a book that would not just appeal to like ex-Mormons or faithful Mormons. We wanted a book that would appeal to everyone, non-Mormons, and I think it really does. It hits that sweet spot where you can kind of look at what the information is and then kind of make your own decisions on how to interpret. We do a lot of interpretation, but some of the interpretation will be from the reader and according to what their belief system is.
Well, it might be like which came first, the chicken or the egg, but I know you're very knowledgeable on the subject, so I want to ask you, did Joseph Smith glean information from the Masons, or did the Masons glean information from Joseph Smith?
Well, I think definitely Joseph was fascinated with Freemasonry, and I think that he used a lot of the trappings of Freemasonry and just his own brilliance and revelation as well to organize the temple endowment and other things that he did with Masonry. But really what I think and what our sort of meta narrative of the book is that Joseph wanted to restore pure Freemasonry, sort of like we all know that he wanted to restore Christianity to its perfect state. And I think that that's what he was trying to do with Freemasonry as well.
Gotcha.
Just think what he would have done with old furniture. If restored them. Made a lot of money.
Yes. And how do we know that he didn't?
There you go. I know that Brigham Young was a carpenter of some sort. And so maybe.
Oh, everyone says it's Brigham, but who knows? It may have just been Joseph.
That's right. And so tell us the story of how secret covenants came about.
Okay, so Gary Bergera from Signature Books was my MTC teacher. So I knew him. Yes, I knew him in the MTC, and I would see him occasionally over the years at like MHA and things like that. Read his wonderful, brilliant articles. And one day he just reached out to me from Signature Books and said, "Would you like to do a book on polygamy?" And at the time, see, I always thought that I never wanted to get into women's issues or polygamy. And as a historian, I wanted to be seen as a serious historian. So I thought that meant, you didn't do women's issues, or you didn't do polygamy. But it seems like I've always been thrown into polygamy over and over and over. And so here it was again, polygamy. And I thought, well, okay, I can do that. And right about that time, it was starting to become an issue in the church. People were looking into polygamy in ways they hadn't before. And but that was just barely starting, and I wasn't really aware of it so much. Originally, Gary wanted me to do a book where I just gathered together articles that had already been written on polygamy and put them together into a book. But I thought, I know enough people who write on this subject that I bet I can get them all to write brand new articles that no one's ever seen before. And so I thought I'd try that. I reached out to about 10 people that I knew, and all of these are names that you have heard of in polygamy. So Devery Anderson, and Todd Compton, Don Bradley, those kind of people. And I reached out to them, and they were all willing to give me something new for the book. And but I gave them kind of a deadline. I said, it has to be, certain length. You have to have it in by such and such a time. And so, I kind of pushed them a little bit. And they were all willing and able to do this, put together these great articles for this book. Some of the authors came back with 80-page articles. And I'd be like, no, you can't have 80 pages. You have to have 50 pages. And they, it's their baby. They don't want to cut 30 pages out of there. So we did a lot of editing. We did a lot of batting back and forth. There were so many footnotes. And so I became quite good at footnotes. And so it turned out to be great. The one author that did work that he'd already been working on, Don Bradley, did do some work on Fanny Alger. You need to do the slash because some members of the family pronounce it one way and some pronounce it the other way. So he had already done some work on that. So he's the one person that that produced something that he'd already, had. He'd done some talks on it at conferences and things like that. But
it was too good to. It was too good to not use.
Oh, yes. It's Dating Fanny Alger. And that's such an awesome title. I couldn't pass that up. And it really is.
I think Randy dated Fanny Alger when he was young.
Back in the day, but she was 102 at the time.
She was a comely woman, though.
Still a looker.
That's right.
Yeah, so he did do her, but I was really thrilled. He did some new work, and so all the articles are amazing. And I hope more people read these articles. They're very easy to read because they are in a compilation. You can read one article, set it aside. You don't have to read 300 pages at once. My Masonry book is very dense. It's hard to get through, but this one is easy to read and really fun. The authors did a great job.
Did you have conversations with them, or did they pretty much know what they were going to do once you gave them a free rein to?
It's probably half and half. Like Mark Tensmeyer, I knew he was kind of one of those who hadn't published before. There are a couple of them that hadn't published before, but he had done a lot of work on like a polygamy timeline, and I'd seen his work online, and so I asked him to do a specific thing for the book. And others, I said, do you have anything you want to contribute? And they had work in their mind that they wanted to do. Susan Staker had some work on Joseph Smith that she really wanted to get published. And so she put that to me, and I thought it sounded great with the Book of Abraham, Joseph and the Book of Abraham and polygamy. That was real interesting. So it was about half and half.
Yeah, so like a potluck dinner, you don't want everybody to bring dessert. So you want to organize it some, but it still has to be somewhat of a luck, for what they do. And so it's good to know ahead of time what everybody's doing. Randy?
And Cheryl, you edited this whole thing, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Now that in and of itself, I don't know if people realize how incredibly time consuming and difficult it is to actually edit. Maybe you didn't have to make a whole lot of edits with the writers that contributed, but you still had to know if
yes, it's true. I mean, people just do not realize what goes into how much goes into editing. And I think this book kind of more than usual, I think I needed to do a lot of editing. Like I said, there are a couple people that hadn't done work like this before. There are a couple of people that had no idea, how to do footnotes. And there were, and there were people that needed to be cut real bad and couldn't cut. So, so there were, it did take a lot of effort on my part. I think also just getting things in a timely manner, because I wanted to get it published. Signature books does take some time when you go through their process, from the time that you put the book in until it's published. And so I wanted to get it in by a certain time. And I wanted to get it in before Gary Bergera left Signature Books. It didn't quite happen, that it wasn't quite published when he left, but it was pretty close. So, I was kind of all on their case all the time. Like, where's your chapter? And what can I do to help you? And in certain cases I could help by providing information and, getting them footnotes that they needed and that kind of thing. So it takes a ton of work.
So give us an idea about if you're going to ask somebody to write a piece about how long was the deadline? Was it 3 months, 6 months?
I really don't remember. I think it was a matter of months, probably about, it may have been 6 months. It may have been 6 months. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Were they open to the edits that you made?
Oh, yes, they were wonderful to work with. All of them are wonderful to work with. And, I've been so lucky that I have worked with a lot of people. And most of my things that I've published have been collaborations with people. And I've been very, very lucky. I think I'm easy to work with myself. But also, I've always found that if you just talk it over, it's fun to talk things over, even if you disagree, and sometimes that you can come to an agreement or a compromise. My third book is on William Marks, and John Dinger and I did that book together, a biography on William Marks. And John and I disagreed slightly on several things, but it was so much fun to just call and talk about it and say, let's look at this document. What do you think about this? And how do you interpret this? And sometimes we were just able to say, well, here are a couple possibilities, because we couldn't come to terms on it. But then other times, like he'd convince me or I'd convince him. I remember a couple of times where I did, talk to him about it, and he was convinced and said, "Oh, okay, that sounds good." And vice versa, he has a lot of knowledge on the law that he brought in, and I was able to see things in a way that I hadn't seen them before. So I love collaboration, and this was great too. Is I think everything that I suggested, people would either push back on me, and I'd say okay, or I was able to get my way. But it was a great experience.
So what was your piece about in the book?
So my piece is about the Partridge sisters, and if Emma participated in those 2 marriages of the Partridge sisters. Everyone assumes that Emma was there at the marriage, but when we look at the documentation, we wonder, was she really there at the marriage of the Partridge sisters?
I should point out for Gene, because he probably doesn't know, this is not the music group, the Partridge Family.
The Partridge Family.
So it wasn't Susan Day and
no, not Susan Day. It was Emily and Eliza Partridge, who were 2 young women who lived with Joseph Smith and Emma. And what their story was that they that Joseph taught them about plural marriage, asked them to marry him, and that they married him in March of 1843. And then in May, Emma became aware of polygamy and gave her permission to Joseph Smith to marry someone, but she said it has to be the Partridge sisters. And so their story is that they didn't want to tell Emma, well, we're already married. So they went through a second marriage ceremony, and Emma Smith was there in that second marriage ceremony. But we have all kinds of documentation that tells us this story is got some problems. So let's look at the documentation and see what we can come up with. And that's what I do in my article.
Was Emma accepting of Joseph's other wives?
Well, that's what the question is. So if she was, it was for a very, very short period of time, like a very short days, maybe, or weeks. But that's what the story is, that she did come to the acceptance, and then she decided no. So we want to dig into that story and see, did she really accept it? Or Andy E. Hatt's thesis talks about, it's really the only place where he says that you had to, in order to get the second anointing, you had to accept polygamy. And so that's his story, is that Emma had to accept polygamy, at least for a short time, so that she could get the second anointing. And then other authors have quoted Andy E. Hatt's thesis. That's the only person they can quote. And so, they've followed this. You look at the trail, you'll see some authors that will say this, and then you go, well, what's your source? It always goes back to Andy E. Hatt's thesis. And so I kind of push back on Andy E. Hatt a little bit, and I say, well, look at thesis. Look at Rosanna and William Marks. They never accepted polygamy that we know of, and yet they were able to get their second. So do we say now, oh, we just don't know about it, but they must have accepted it for a short time? Or do we say maybe Emma didn't ever accept polygamy?
Wow.
Yeah. And I suppose it's possible that for some people, Joseph said, hey, in order to have the second anointing, you have to accept polygamy. And so those people did. And then to others, they said no. And he was like, okay, well, you can have the second anointing anyway.
Okay, so there's another possibility. So this is what I love, because in this world, and I've become really involved with it lately, because we have polygamy deniers, or monogamy affirmers, they like to call themselves as well, who say that perhaps Joseph never practiced polygamy, caught it. And so we start looking at the documents, and we see that many times you can come up with 2 or 3 or 4 different explanations of what happened. We just did that, Jean. And we can't always look at the documents and say, oh, the documents show this definitely happened. And that's why we're in the state that we are today, with, these polemic arguments where one side says one thing and one says the other, because you look at the document, it can be read both ways. So that's what's so fascinating about it.
And that's what I think is valuable about the Journal of Mormon Polygamy, is you're going to have more people focus on the scholarship around polygamy, and it could only lead to good outcomes, right? It's going to be a clearer, sharper picture on things. Or it could be a whole bunch of other, suggested outcomes or paths.
No, absolutely. Because what we wanted to do is Michelle Stone and I wanted to get a scholarly place where we could have this conversation. Because, you do have, with the monogamy affirmers, you have some people that are really going into it in a scholarly way, really digging into the documents, bringing out some new interesting things. And then you have people that are kind of all up in the night with, very strange suppositions and not very good historical conclusions. So what we wanted to do is we wanted to have a place where we could have people submit articles, that peer-reviewed scholarly articles, to be published, to go out into the, into this this Mormon space, and people can in a scholarly way push against it, publish about it, and that way I think it elevates the discourse, and we're not just fighting about it, but we're looking at what could be the possibilities.
For the listeners who don't know who Michelle is, she is one of these people that is a polygamy denier. Is that correct?
Or monogamy affirmer.
A monogamy affirmer. There you go.
So what they want to say is their stance is that Joseph Smith only practiced monogamy during his life. They do believe that polygamy was happening in Nauvoo, but this was through others such as Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and others were doing polygamy sort of on the sly or behind Joseph Smith's back, and that he always publicly denied it. Emma Smith always publicly denied it. Hiram Smith always publicly denied it. And so it's not as far off as you think it is. I started off thinking these people don't know what they're talking about. We have many, many, many documents that shows that Joseph was a polygamist. But when we start getting down to what the documents are, there are anomalies. There are different ways of reading it. And so I think that I have not changed my mind that I believe Joseph Smith practiced and taught polygamy. But I do feel like it's much more nuanced than people think it is. Right. A reasonable person can make that conclusion.
And there's obviously, you know, in a way, the church is to blame, we'll say, for all these issues, right? And if you think about it, it had to be a secret back then because otherwise it would go against bigamy laws, anti-bigamy laws, right? Mm-hmm. Or against people's sensibilities who you still wanted them to still pay tithing, you know, like milk before the meat kind of a situation. Mm-hmm. And then in Utah, when they felt far enough away from the federal government, they announce it as a for sure doctrine. And then they don't really even publish the revelation until decades later, or
1852. Mm-hmm.
So they published the section 132 in 1852.
No, it was announced in 1852, but yes, it didn't become part of the Doctrine and Covenants until years later.
Yeah, and so, and then you have Joseph F. Smith going around getting not subpoenas. What's the other legal word?
Affidavits. Michelle and I have teamed up to do a book on the Joseph F. Smith 1869 affidavits. And this is going to be really an exciting work. We're going to hopefully do this through Coford Books. And we're well into the writing of this to look carefully at Joseph F. Smith's affidavits. And we have an article on one of the affidavits, William Clayton's affidavit, that's out on the Journal of Mormon Polygamy right now. So you can see just a little sample of our work, what we do when we work together.
And what was Joseph F. Smith's motivation for collecting affidavits?
So I believe that Joseph F., and I think Michelle believes this as well, I believe that Joseph F. Smith did believe that his father, Hiram Smith, and Joseph Smith practiced polygamy. But he looked around in the late 1860s and he realized because Joseph Smith III was pushing against this, saying, my father never practiced polygamy.
Because that's what my mom says.
Yeah, so he was saying, well, Joseph F. Smith said, well, let's get some evidence out here. And he realized we don't have a lot of evidence to show the RLDS church that Joseph practiced polygamy. So we thought, well, many of these people are alive, they're older, but let me get some affidavits drawn up and have them sign them. And then we can have some evidence that Joseph did practice polygamy.
Cheryl, I hope that this question isn't elementary, but what is the church's stance? You know, Michelle feels one way, you feel one way, and you feel the same way on several topics. What is the church's official stance on whether Joseph Smith was or was not a polygamist?
So the church does have an official kind of a narrative, and they tell it through the book Saints. That's kind of our official history. It's very, it's not really rigorous historically, but it does tell what the church's stance is. And the church's stance is that Joseph practiced and taught polygamy, that it was for that time only, that it was commanded of God, and that at a certain point of time, it was no longer commanded of God. And so
it was hard to obey the commandment.
Yes, Jean. It was. So yes, they have come out with several official, semi-official documents and
Like
church,
the gospel
like
topics
Sunday school
essays.
teachings that have talked about polygamy and their stance on polygamy. And so it's very hard for them to listen to these people that are monogamy affirmers because they do have an official narrative. And they don't want to mess with that official narrative.
And I think, it almost depended on who your instructor was when, like me, you and Randy all grew up in the 70s. And you joined the church around the end of the 1970s.
79.
79. And you could have an elders quorum. You could say somebody would quote a document that says, Joseph Smith said, "I've been accused of having 7 wives and I look around and only see one, or only find one," or however he says it, right? And then I remember an institute being taught as a young college student that polygamy was offered by Joseph Smith to some of his closest associates to give their wives to him. But then that was only a Abrahamic test, and that they didn't really have to give their wives, but they had to promise that they would, to show that they were true believing people, that Joseph was a prophet. And so
Gene, you're right. Back in the 70s, in the late 70s, we were hiding that. We were kind of hiding the fact that Joseph practiced polygamy. We didn't want to, and there wasn't the internet, so you couldn't really check on this. We didn't.
We're beating around the flaming sword.
Right. So we weren't making that apparent. The church wasn't really denying it, but they were kind of hiding it. They didn't want a lot of people to know that this started with Joseph. And so that kind of, like, as Brian Hales says, that kind of bit them in the end, because now you have people that say, well, I was taught that Joseph didn't practice polygamy. But now the church is saying, yes, we did, but that was just for a certain time.
Well, it's hard for them to deny several things now that we have the internet and we're discovering so many of these journals and affidavits. And I was just curious. So it sounds to me like those who are monogamy believers are actually, like you said, teaching against what the church is now recognizing.
Yes. So they're putting themselves in a very difficult position. Although, like I said, I think a reasonable person can look at the documents and make this conclusion. I personally don't conclude this from looking at the documents, but there are not as many documents as we believe there are that come right out and say this. A lot of the women that talk about their polygamy with Joseph Smith, many of them will say things like, when polygamy was taught in Nauvoo, I gained a testimony of it. But leaving out, did Joseph teach it to you, or was it Brigham or Heber? Who was it that taught it to you? And they don't come out and say it, And so you can look at that document and say, you can make either conclusion from that document.
Are there any offspring from Joseph Smith who are results of his polygamy that say, yeah, my great-great-grandfather?
No, and this is the big thing that the polygamy deniers have on their side, is that they can show now through DNA evidence that we do not have any descendants of Joseph Smith. So that would be kind of the smoking gun, right? If we had a descendant that we could show through DNA, they'd have to just put up and shut up, because that's, how do you argue with that?
So, we have people doing all these DNA tests now to learn more about their heritage. And so it's possible, as more and more people join these DNA, what would you call it, groupings or evidence collection, maybe something will show up. And
Gene, the thing is that there are only, you look and you can identify which children, there are only a very few of them that possibly could have been Joseph Smith's offspring. And so when Ugo Perigo did this DNA testing, he took all the possibilities. And I believe there are a couple, 1 or 2 that maybe the descendants did not give their permission. But I think in the majority of cases, he knows who those people are and was able to perform DNA testing on them. So it's not going to be like people are going to just pop up and, oh, here's a descendant. We know who those could possibly be.
Right.
So polygamists, from some of these groups that we know of today, one of their main purposes is to multiply and replenish the earth. And I have to wonder if that was Joseph's stance, because you would think that if that were the case, then we'd have several descendants. Or is it possible that he only took them to care for them and not reproduce with them?
Yeah, so this is what's fascinating to me, is that we really don't know what his motivations could have been, because what it says in D&C 132 is so different than what we think Joseph was practicing, or even what Brigham Young was doing. This is a polygamy that no one has ever practiced, with the virgins and with all kinds of things that just didn't happen in Mormon polygamy. So there's just many families that were wondering, what could Joseph had in mind? Did he have the scriptural injunction of multiplying? If so, why didn't he have lots of descendants? Or why is it that we can look and say that polygamous families don't have more descendants than if the women were just married, each one was married to a different man? We don't have more descendants this way. So, there are many. So I don't think that that's what Joseph Smith was doing with polygamy. But if you do think that that's an important part of polygamy, then you're kind of in a hard place to describe what was happening.
That's right. And Section 132 doesn't even talk about dynastic sealings or anything like that. And people were doing it, right?
See a lot of.
So there obviously were some teachings that were happening that weren't necessarily written down at the time.
Yeah, and it's still, looking into Mormon polygamy is still fascinating. It's just the gift that keeps on giving. People can continue writing about it, and there are so many different aspects of it that haven't been explored yet. And that's why I think this Journal of Mormon Polygamy is going to be great, because we're going to be able to publish some of these things in a scholarly way, in an academic way, that it'll be able to proliferate what we're able to find out, rather than just where it is right now. Is you have a very few places that you can publish, and many of these people can't get published in the venues that are available right now. So hopefully we'll be able to see a lot more on Mormon polygamy, and we'll be able to bring out all these nuances.
That's right. So the book is Secret Covenants, New Insights on Early Mormon Polygamy. And there's, in every year, you're going to have new insights because of the Journal of Mormon Polygamy, right?
Yep.
Like you said, it's the gift that keeps on giving.
It is.
Yeah. I can't wait to read your next book coming out. And that's the one that you're collaborating with Michelle on?
That's right.
Yeah. That'll be really interesting to see the two schools of thought together.
Yes. And this is fascinating because no one has done a lot of digging into the Joseph F. Smith affidavits. So we've used them, but we haven't really looked in depth at what they are, how they were created. Did they actually get signed by these people? And, just so many really interesting, what are the anomalies in there? What are the problems with the affidavits, and what are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And with Michelle and I both working together, it's so good, because like a lot of times I'll make just an assumption and I'll put it in there, and she'll be like, wait, that's not, how I see it. And then I'll have to look at it again and say, oh, and it's the same thing for her. She'll think that something is just very obvious. And I'll point out, oh, we have this other document here that we can look at. So working together is making our work a lot stronger.
That's right.
You're the Siskel and Ebert of polygamy.
Yes, we are.
There you go. And it's like, I believed in Santa Claus for a little while because I was told to believe in Santa Claus. And if there were, and then every now and then, these movies come out and they sort of almost tease like there really is a Santa Claus, but, we're told there's no Santa Claus. And so it's a myth that they keep on, bringing out in the different genres of, winter Santa movies, but it's nobody's ever shown any DNA evidence, right?
Well, now you're messing with my mind. Are you saying that maybe he doesn't exist? Because that's going to freak me out a little.
That's right. The gifts magically appear underneath the Christmas tree. So anyhow, thanks, Cheryl, for coming on the show. Thanks, Randy, for co-hosting. And everybody buy the book. We'll have a link in the description. And have a great rest of 2025. And share, like, and subscribe. All right. Thanks.
Cheryl.
It was great to talk to you.
Bye-bye.